just wanted to weigh in on the current situation with Russia and just give my take on all this Russian hysteria. I mean, people are just losing their minds. I mean, this anti-Russian sentiment is just gone into hyperdrive. I mean, it's nothing new. There's always been a anti-Russian feeling in the West. That's been programmed into us for for certainly 2 generations. The main mistake people make is they still think Russia is the Soviet Union, when it's not. I mean, the Soviet Union collapsed over 30 years ago, and Russia came out of the Soviet Union. But Russia is not the Soviet Union. That's a fundamental mistake people make, and they've carried with them that anti-Soviet feeling. Certainly the boomer generation, of course, that carried over into the younger generations. I think that's the root cause, and of course the media and the governments, they play up to that. And you know how many people still think Russia is a communist state? I mean, a lot of people still believe that. I mean, how retarded do you have to be? I mean, okay, if you don't know, you don't know, but still, it's less communist than Western Europe in many respects. Okay? I mean, I'm not going to get into that now. Russia is not communist. Far from it. The Soviet Union, yes, the Soviet Union was when Russia got co-opted by the Bolsheviks, let's just do a bit of history. So the Bolsheviks took control just over 100 years ago. And yes, they were bad. The Bolsheviks were the most despicable people ever to have lived, in my opinion. Certainly in modern history, you could go back to the Mongols and the Huns, and but in our history, in modern history, by far, the Bolsheviks were okay, maybe the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, but I'm saying the Bolsheviks, they're responsible for more deaths in Europe than any other political movement. Anyway, they hijacked Russia for 70 years, So Russia was, Russia was the largest nation to come out of the Soviet Union. They threw off the yoke of communism. But anyway, going back to, so the Bolsheviks, they were just terrible people. And certainly up until the death of Stalin, I mean, they committed some of the worst atrocities you could think of. Everyone talks about the Nazis and how bad they were. They were nothing compared to the Soviets. I mean, what the Soviets were doing prior to World War II, and of course during World War II, it wasn't really till 1955 when Stalin finally kicked it that it started to be a little bit less bad. I say that lightly, but even so. Anyway, Russia comes out of the Soviet Union in the 90s, early 90s, and I mean it falls into this backwater country, and I think that's where the reputation that's where its reputation comes from. This sort of poor, corrupt, dangerous, which it certainly was. I mean, with the end of the authoritarian regime came quite a weak government. So you had all kinds of organized crime plaguing the country. The oligarchs basically took control of the economy, and I'm not talking about just domestic oligarchs. I'm talking about Western and foreign entities. They came in and just plundered the country. And I mean, they were like a bunch of vultures feeding off what they thought was a dying carcass. But they were mistaken. It wasn't. Because along came new management. And who was that? Our good old friend Vladimir Putin. That's right. So he came in the late 90s and started putting order into the country. He kicked out the oligarchs, and the Western big corporations that were plundering Russia lost out. I mean, they thought they were rubbing their hands. They were like, oh boy, this is like colonialism all over again, So, I mean, that's what the West does. I mean, they are colonial. They colonized the world. They took Africa, most of Asia, the New World, and I mean that's one of the reasons why the West got so rich. But anyway, modern colonialism is not the same as colonialism 300 years ago. I'm not saying colonialism is necessarily bad. It did some good things to the world, but modern colonialism is just plunder. It's just financial gain. That's all it is. I mean, it's just they're not bringing any kind of cultural values or they're not civilizing any barbarian cultures. They're not stopping human sacrifice. Like they were like when the Spanish turned up in the New World and were horrified by what the Aztecs and Mayans were doing. But anyway, that's another thing altogether. But yeah, I mean, that's really the mistake people are making. They think Russia is still this communist backwater and is ruled by some tyrant who's hell bent on world domination, which is just, it's ridiculous. I mean, and anyone who understands geopolitics would have at least some sympathy for what's happening in Russia and Ukraine right now. Going back to the 90s again, one of the preconditions for allowing Germany to reunify was NATO would not expand any further. So they understood East Germany was going to join the West and, of course, be part of NATO. Now, all these other countries in sort of Central and Eastern Europe were part of what was called the Warsaw Pact. And that was the opposing alliance of NATO. They basically were there to shield Russia shield the Soviet Union from a Western threat. Because, I mean, if you look at history in the last, certainly 200 years, it's actually the West that's invaded Russia. So Napoleon, that's one. The Napoleonic Wars. There was the Crimean War, which involved the coalition of the British, the French, I think the Austrians, I think Turkey was involved, and they were fighting the Russians. And that was disastrous for the Russians. They didn't fare too well in that. Then there was World War I, and Germany actually defeated the Russian Empire and imposed their own terms, which were undone, of course, after the Treaty of Versailles a year or two later. And then, of course, World War II. And every time, Russia's suffered terribly, especially World War II, which even now, I mean, World War II cost Russia so much that even today, you can see the effects. Certainly on population. Everyone alive today in Russia has someone who was killed or taken prisoner or had something to do with World War II. I mean, the loss of life was just colossal, and it's affected Russia, to this day. So the leadership needed to come up with a plan in order to offset the risk of being invaded, because, like I said, in the last two, well, actually no, it was only 150 years. In the 150 years prior to World War II, probably less than that. But yeah, let's just say 150 years, they were invaded, 4 times? So these Central European states were created into puppet regimes. They were ruled by puppets for the interest of guarding the Soviet Union, which it did. But anyway, so when that all collapsed in 1991, these countries started joining NATO. And NATO had promised Russia that wouldn't happen. They said, oh, no, don't worry, we'll just take East Germany, because they wanted to reunify East Germany with West. And they said, okay, fine. Russia said, okay, no problem, but just don't expand any further, because East Germany, of course, was going to join NATO as it was part of West Germany. But no, sure enough, they lied. Every few years, they added new countries to NATO. And the ones that really encroached and bothered Russia the most were the Baltics in 2004, I believe. Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, because they're so close to St. Petersburg. I mean, they are really close. If you look at a map, how close they are. If ever there was an invasion, that would be a staging ground, and it wouldn't take long to push on Russia's second largest city, St. Petersburg, formerly known as Leningrad. Anyway, but Russia was not really in a position to do anything about it at the time. They like I said, Russia was really a bad place. In the 90s, it was not a nice place. It was, like I said, it was corrupt. It was a lot of people were poor. For the average person, it was not a good place. And of course, militarily, politically, the whole country was, it was finding its feet again. Basically, it had to get its balance back, get its bearings. But anyway, they managed to. And with Vladimir Putin, he's really the architect of modern day Russia. Anyway, so at the time, they really, they couldn't really do much about NATO expansion. And slowly but surely, NATO kept adding these countries: Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Baltic states. Then in 2008, they promised They promised Ukraine and Georgia NATO membership. And if you may remember, the Russians went into Georgia. There was a short war there in 2008. Russia then allowed for the creation of 2 separate republics, both confiscated from Georgia. That would be South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So they created 2 new republics, which most of the world doesn't recognize to this day. So Russia's intervention basically thwarted NATO's attempt at Georgia joining NATO, because Georgia is right on Russia's southern border, very close to the oil fields of the south, very close to their coast. Well, it's right next to their Black Sea coast, their Caspian Sea coast. It's a very important, Russia's southern sector is it's quite vulnerable, but it's protected by the Caucasian mountain range. So, which Georgia is on the Russian side. So if NATO were to take Georgia, then they would have a foothold on the other side of the Caucasian mountains, which would pose a serious threat to Russia, because those mountains are a natural obstacle, a natural barrier that protects Russia's south. So they couldn't allow Georgia to join NATO. Absolutely not. That would have been disastrous, strategically terrible for Russia. And of course, next came Ukraine. So by now, Russia was really making sure that the countries on its peripherals were not going to fall into the sphere of NATO. And of course, Ukraine was the next on NATO's list. And they were promised NATO membership. Let's see, Ukraine, then I believe it was Yanukovych who became president of Ukraine. Of course, he was friendly to Russia and Vladimir Putin. Then it's 2014, and the West decides it's time to carry out a coup in Ukraine. It's time to move in on Ukraine. So they sent their agents of subversion, the CIA. They funded the opposition in Ukraine, because Ukraine is a very divided country. You have to understand the Western Ukraine is very pro-European. They want to be part of the West. They think that it's all sunshine and rainbows in the EU. And the east of Ukraine is very pro-Russian. Geographically, it makes sense. They're right next to Russia, and the western part is next to Europe, Central Europe anyway. So this coup installs a Western puppet regime under Poroshenko, and the eastern provinces of Ukraine, which are populated by Russian people mostly, in the Donbass, they decided they didn't want to be part of this new pro-Western puppet regime. So they declared independence. And we have the two states of Luhansk, the two republics of Luhansk and I can't remember. Anyway, the two republics of the Donbass, and they almost immediately were attacked by the Ukrainian army, who the regime saw as insurgents, basically, as Russian insurgents, and all they wanted was to leave Ukraine. I mean, historically, that territory is Russian. The people there are Russian, so I mean, why not? I mean, Crimea was peacefully annexed by, or should I say, reclaimed by Russia. It wasn't annexed. It wasn't conquered. It wasn't invaded. It was reclaimed by Russia. I mean, Crimea is Russian. It was given to Ukraine in the 50s, I think, which didn't make much difference at the time, but it is a Russian-speaking land. It's Russian territory, so it really doesn't belong to Ukraine at all. And there's no way Vladimir Putin was going to allow Crimea to be taken over by NATO, because if Ukraine fell to NATO with Crimea, then Russia's Black Sea fleet would be compromised. They really wouldn't. They probably would lose their fleet, because they would have very little movement, very little room to move inside the Black Sea, because, well, if you look at the geography, the entire south is controlled by Turkey, and Turkey's NATO. Russia has a relatively small coastline along the northeast Black Sea, and of course the Sea of Azov, but the rest of the Black Sea would be dominated by NATO, basically. So they would have this tiny fleet in northeastern corner of the Black Sea, which would be meaningless. So they couldn't allow Crimea to be they had to take Crimea. They just basically had to do it. They had no choice. But anyway, I mean, this whole, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyway, so the separatists in the separatists, I say, they just wanted to rejoin Russia. Basically, they were being supported by Russia, and of course, why wouldn't they? You've got Russian people being attacked and persecuted by Kiev, so naturally, Putin was going to send in support, and of course, the West accused him of starting the war, which is far from the truth. I mean, that's just an outright lie, and it took. I mean, that was 8 years ago. And then, of course, you fast forward to 2022. You got Russia who, they decided to invade because the Minsk agreement couldn't be reached. The Ukrainians were not honoring the Minsk agreement. And shelling and attacks increased in the east. I mean, basically, they were being goaded by the West to antagonize Russia further. So, yes, go on. You keep attacking. Step up the attacks. Don't worry, if Russia does anything, we've got your back. We'll step in. And, well, we know what happened. So Putin's actions, they are not irrational. These are perfect. I mean, I'm not defending. I'm trying not to take sides here. I'm trying to look at the most rational actors at play here. And from what I see, Putin is the most rational, whether you like him or not. He is. You know, it's not like he didn't give any warning. And he's not this madman imperialist that the West accuse him of. The West behave like mad imperialists. I mean, that's another thing. In the West, no one knows who's in charge. In the USA, we have a completely decrepit, inept, old man who can't even speak properly. In Britain, we have a clown. In France, we have a narcissistic wannabe Napoleon. In Germany, we have a bumbling buffoon. And they're all just fools. I mean, in Hungary, we have Orban, and he's actually quite fond of Putin. So, yeah, no one can point the finger at any one leader in the West and say, oh, he's just a power-hungry tyrant because we have democracy and They're basically actors. That's all they are. They're actors reading from a script that was given to them. They're there just to take the flak when things don't go, according to plan or whatever. So it's very easy to hide from accountability. Because who do you blame? You just blame Biden. Okay, fine. The whole country hates Biden, but it doesn't affect those that actually control what's going on because no one knows who they are. And most people still think that there's this democracy where you can just vote your way out of things. No. Two-party system is fake. Anyway, that's a discussion for another video. So yeah, I just wanted to weigh in on this situation with Russia. I mean, the media have got people so wound up and most people still believe them, which just baffles me. I don't understand why people believe all these propaganda machines, because that's what they are. They're not news. You have a war that's been going on for 8 years in the Donbass, which was started by Ukraine against Russians. Russians support the Russians in the Donbass. The war keeps going on, it flares up every now and then. And then finally, Putin says, okay, you know what? You didn't listen to any of my warnings. I can't take any of you seriously. I don't know who's in charge. You lie. And I know you hate my country and you want to destroy my country. So I have no choice. I cannot allow you guys to take Ukraine, especially with the current regime that's talking about getting nuclear weapons. I mean, are you kidding me? You think he's just going to let them point nukes on Russia's doorstep like that? Never mind nukes. I mean, just cruise missiles, just the fact that they're so close to Russia. And look, NATO, the whole point of NATO is to be hostile to Russia. That's the whole, well, it was designed to be hostile to the Warsaw Pact, but that collapsed. But NATO then technically didn't need to exist, and it should have been dismantled. But no, they kept it because the Western powers wanted to destroy Russia. So they kept NATO as a way to keep Russia off balance, which it did for a while. But Russia has found its feet again, and the West is panicking because they are losing they've got the global government that they want in their sights. They can see it. And Russia is a huge obstacle to them. It looks like their plans are going to be destroyed. Unless they can take down Russia, which I don't see how they can do that. I mean, if they can topple the regime somehow, but I just don't see it. I mean, they can topple, regimes in the Arab world, Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi, but these are small countries compared to Russia. They can't even topple Iran. And Iran, okay, Iran's not that small of a country, but compared to Russia, it's not as powerful. No way. That's why they want Ukraine, because if they could take Ukraine into NATO, then it would really put Russia in a very precarious position, because then they could pinch off Belarus, and they might even be able to launch some kind of land invasion from the south, the north, encircle Moscow, and that's it. I mean, I'm just speculating, Anyway, in a way, Putin had no choice. He had to do what he did. So that's all I've got to say for now.